All right. Well, it is so good to see you here this morning. I am so excited that we are at the very end of the book of Ecclesiastes. If you are a first-time guest with us this morning, I want to extend a welcome to you. I'm Pastor Billy, and our tendency here at New Life is to go through a book of the Bible, verse by verse, just kind of work through the book. And so we've been trekking along through the book of Ecclesiastes since the beginning of August, and it's been quite a journey. And I pray that you have a new perspective on this great book. It's, as I mentioned from the very beginning, a very difficult book to understand. A lot of the difficulty lies in the fact that it's written many, many years ago. We're looking into another culture, another world, trying to do the heavy lifting of really getting to the meaning of the text is our desire here at New Life, because if we don't understand the text, we'll never be able to apply the text. And so application really comes from a good understanding of what the text is saying. And so we try to lay that out for you this week. And as I've mentioned, we're in chapter 12, ending it up today. We'll be working through the 14 verses of this chapter. And next week, we'll kind of transition to our focus on Christmas, certainly the Sunday before Christmas. And then the following week, we'll continue in kind of a Christmas message, a focus message there. And then the first week in January, I want to encourage you to be here, as I'm going to be laying out for our congregation where we're headed through 2020, what we're going to be looking at, what we're going to be doing. So we've got a lot of work laid up for us in the next few weeks as we prepare our hearts to enter into a new year. And so before we get there, we've got to work through Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And as I was working through Ecclesiastes 12, I was reminded of a story that my wife, for whatever reason, she likes to recall this story. Seems like she recalls it every time about this time of year. Once a year, this is a once a year kind of story, and it seems to always come up at this time of year. And of course, many of you who have been here and been a part of our gathering, you know that I have some of the 8-year-old Billy stories. 8-year-old Billy stories. And so here's an 8-year-old Billy story for you. You know, here in the South, we don't get a lot of frozen weather, right? So maybe the cold weather brings out this story from my wife. But we had a nice little freeze take place in the mid part of the state, and the ponds in the community were frozen over. And I can remember as a young kid, me and 3 other boys will get into all kind of mischievous, especially when they're 8. Got to watch those 8-year-old guys. And, you know, we got this great idea that we were going to do some ice fishing. And so there was a pond out, and we had a big cinder block. And our strategy was to take this cinder block out to the middle of this pond and throw the block into the pond so we could get our lines down in the water and do some fishing. We didn't calculate the fact that there was probably about 2, maybe 3 inches of ice at best, you know, and it probably wasn't a good idea to stand out in the middle of the pond and throw a cinder block in the middle of it, you know, when you're standing out there on top of 2 or 3 inches of ice, if that much, maybe an inch and a half. And so we made our way out on the pond, on the ice, the covered ice, and I guess by God's grace, the guy that was carrying the block actually slipped and he fell and ended up breaking his arm. And so we didn't make it out to the middle of the pond where we were going to throw this cinder block. And so as I was studying Ecclesiastes chapter 12, that image just kept popping in my mind. And the reason I believe that image continued to pop into my mind is because Ecclesiastes chapter 12 is really dealing with the question of what are we anchored to? Where is our anchor? Are we going through life walking on a sheet of ice with a cinder block and hoping that we're going to be anchored to that? Is that the essence of our anchor? And so this morning, as you are sitting here, I want you to think about what you're anchored to in life. What is your anchor? As you go through life, what is the thing that you're anchored to? And this chapter is going to be just an amazing chapter that we're going to be able to study together. And it's going to really deal, again, with this idea of going through life. What do we find ourselves anchored to? And so Ecclesiastes chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. And he writes, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. In the day with that the watchmen of the house tremble, and mighty men stoop, the grinding ones stand idle because they are few, and those who look through windows grow dim. And the doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and the daughters of songs will sing softly. Furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. The almond tree blossoms, and the grasshopper drags himself along, and the capeberry is ineffective. For man goes to his eternal home, while mourners go ahead in the street." Verse 6, "Remember him before the silver cord is broken, and the golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel of the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." Verse 8, very familiar phrase that he's used throughout this book. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. All is vanity. In addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and write the words of truth correctly. The words of wise men are like goads, and the master of these collectors are well-driven nails, and they are given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil." So as you can see, as we work through chapter 12, Solomon, the author of this book, is writing to us, and he has a lot to say, and some of it even seems confusing. And so as we do every week, I like to break down the chapter to kind of provide a roadmap for where we're going. And so a brief outline will help us get there. The first section, verses 1 to 7, get to know God early in life. That's going to be his counsel. As you go through life, get to know God early. The earlier, the better. And then the second section is going to be verses 8 through 14, and he's going to teach us on how to establish a knowledge of God. This is how you get to know God. Get to know God early in life, and by the way, this is the process by which you go in developing that knowledge. So verses 1 to 7, now I think it's only fair to highlight this. If you were here last week, really this is a larger section that begins back in chapter 11, verse 7. So it goes primarily through chapter 11 and then the first 7 verses of chapter 12. Remember, we didn't have verses and chapters in the original writing, and so chapter 11, 1 to 7 throughout the rest of the chapter, and chapter 12, verses 1 to 7 go together as one section. And in that section, he's talking to the younger generation. He's saying to the younger generation, you need to make sure you walk with God. And he's going to emphasize that again in chapter 12 in these first 7 verses. And so the appropriate question to ask is, why should I get to know God early in life? Well, why should I be concerned about getting to know God early in life? I absolutely love it when our granddaughter gets to visit, and I love watching her develop. She's almost a year old now. She has a couple of days left before she turns 1. And even at a very early age, Mom and Dad and Lolly and Pop have been working with Isabel, trying to get her to understand that there is a God. We sit down at the table, we say a prayer, and for many of you, you grew up in a home like that, where God was emphasized, and he was identified at a very young age. I love some of the books that are even out today on children's stories, reading the books and telling the story of Christmas, or the story of Easter, or whatever the story may be about God, but communicating to the child that there is a creator. And so Solomon is going to come along and he's going to emphasize this. He's going to say it's important to get to know God early in life. That's an important thing to do. As you go through life, make sure you get to know him early. Now, why is this important? He's going to answer this for us in these 7 verses. And the reason he's going to give is because as you get older, it gets harder. The reality is, as you grow in age, as you grow older, it gets harder and harder and harder to learn truths about God. That's just a reality. So, notice what he says, beginning in verse 1. He says, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. There's the emphasis of knowing God when you're young. If you're here this morning and you're 25 or younger, Solomon would pull you aside and he would say, get to know God. Make life about knowing God. Develop patterns and routines in your life at a young age, walking with God. Know your Creator the early days of your youth, before the evil days come and years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. The reality is, as you go through life, as you get older, age begins to creep in and you come to the perspective that I really don't have a lot of delight in this old age. It's difficult. It's hard. And what Solomon is going to do is he's going to, in verses 2 down through 5, give us 2 pictures. And then in 6 and 7, he's going to give us 4 specific images. Watch these 2 pictures that he provides for us. Verse 2, before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. Now that's an interesting imagery there. The imagery is a storm has come, and then all of a sudden here comes another storm. That's what he says older age is like. You get to a place in life when the storm is here, and you just thought it was a big storm because here comes the really big storm. And so that's the picture that he provides for us. One of the pictures of this storm moving in. The days are darkened and the rain returns. And then he says in verse 3, in the day that the watchmen of the house tremble. And so he's going to give us a picture of a house here. The watchmen of a house tremble. What is he referring to here? Well, many that study this text believe that what he's actually talking about is he's looking at the body as an image of a house. And with older age, obviously, there sets in a little bit of trembling. And so the watchman of the house is signifying the body, that there's trembling going on. And mighty men mighty men stoop. You see in old age again that the older you get, you kind of go down a little bit more and more. The stooping of the old age is what he has in mind. The grinding ones stand idle because they are few. Do you have any guess what he's talking about there? He's talking about your teeth. The grinding ones, they kind of cease their activity because there's few. There's not many grinders that are taking place because there are not many grinders that are available. They're standing idle. And then those who look through the windows grow dim. What do you think he's talking about there? Obviously his eyes, looking through the windows, growing dim. I remember talking to a lady that was checking out my eyes. I went to the eye doctor and she was checking out my eyes, and I said, I'm at a phase right now that I feel like if you could just add more light, I could see a lot better. I find myself going into the restaurant, taking my iPhone out and turning the light on so I can read the menu. If I just had a little bit more light. Well, that's kind of the description that he's providing here. When those lights start getting dim, that's old age. And the doors on the street are shut. The sound of the grinding mill is low. And of course here he's talking about the doors of the street. He's talking about your mouth. I don't know if you've noticed in a person that ages, it's almost like the mouth begins to cave in a bit. You see that take place, and again, the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the birds. Have you reached that place yet? When you get up and you just can't sleep, you're awake. The birds are outside. You have insomnia. That's old age. Guys who are younger here, that's what you've got to look forward to. You get up with the birds, and all the daughters of the song will sing softly. It's interesting, the end of verse 4 here connected with verse 5. Furthermore, the daughters of the song sing softly. The idea again is you're at a place where the sounds come in just so soft, and it's like I need more light, but I need more volume too. Pump up the light and pump up the volume. I can't hear as good. Verse 5, furthermore, men are afraid of high places and of terrors on the road. So the idea there is when you get older, the high places, just do not look as delightful as they did when you were young. You were young and energetic, and heights had no fear over you. You could climb anything. You could stand up, and you could, feel like I've got so much confidence up here. But the older you get, you're kind of holding on. You know what I'm saying? You kind of hold on the higher you get. And so that's the imagery that he's developing here. And terrors on the road. There's a lot of fear. We can't go out at 7 o'clock. Somebody might shoot us. We can't. I'm concerned. They might be in the mall. I'm worried about traveling to the mall. There's the anxiety. And I love this one, the almond tree blossoms. What do you think he's talking about there? He's talking about the gray hair coming out. The almond tree's blossoming. It's turning white. The grasshopper drags himself along. Some of the people who are aged, there's not a lot of spunk in their step. They're just kind of dragging themselves along. As I've read through this, I'm just amazed that the idea of when we start out in life, it's almost like we end up in life kind of where we started out in life. You look forward to when you were young, eating, sleeping, and going to the doctor. And so when you get older, you kind of eat, sleep, and go to the doctor. And I was thinking particularly about this grasshopper imagery here, dragging himself along. We have a video of Izzy when she's learning to crawl. We're trying to teach her to crawl, and we put a little toy just a few feet ahead of her to get her to scoot across the floor, and I got this video, and I'm showing her, come to this to get this toy, you can do it, Izzy, and she's so irritated, trying to crawl, and she was at our house this past week, and now, boy, she's moved into a full crawl now. I mean, she's like going, she's cruising the furniture, and she's past that grasshopper crawling phase, and she's got some spunk in her step. And so you go back to that. It's the image of going back to that part of life. And the Cape Berry is ineffective. And what he's talking about there is your desires. The desires that you once had in life are no longer there. You have sexual desires. You have desires for food, and they just kind of seem to fade the older you get. You're just not as interested. The desires fade away. And then he ends this section here, for man goes to the eternal home while mourners go about the street. Man goes to the eternal home while mourners go throughout the street. So, in other words, what the the author is saying is God is preparing you for an eternal place. Like you're headed somewhere. This is not eternal. And the problem is we try to go through life thinking that this is eternal, that this is as good as it gets. And when we go through life and the lights get dimmer and the noise goes down and the body begins to stoop over, we're thinking, why is it like this? Well, what's wrong? This is not right. The reality is you're not created for this as eternity. You're created for something much better. Mourners go about the street. Now the four images. Notice what he says in verse 6. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. The imagery there is that life is fragile. As you age, as you get older, life becomes very fragile. Isn't that so true? I mean, you once had no fear in you. You could climb heights and it was no big concern, but you get a little wobbly in the knees and you get a little more fearful. And you kind of hold on to things a little tighter because, the truth of the matter is Izzy can fall trying to walk and she can bump her head and, hit her bottom, but she'll get right back up and take off. But for many people, a slight fall means, a broken hip, and it means pneumonia. And so I gotta be careful. And so the fact that life is fragile is the image that's created here. And the other image, notice the pitcher by the well is shattered and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. In other words, what he is saying is the thing that once was functional is now broken. It's not functioning like it used to function before. It's not working properly. That's the reality of where we are all headed. Then he says in verse 7, then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. I love the vision here of the spirit returning to God. It's the image back in the garden where God breathed life into man. He breathed the spirit into man. And now it's at a point in the man's life where now God is taking that back. God gave you life. He gave you spirit. Now God is bringing that back from you. And that's where we are all headed. And so Solomon says in a very profound way, he's going to teach us on how we can get to know God better. Because we're all headed there. And unfortunately, we hold on to anchors that are not secure in life. And he's saying, make sure that you have a secure anchor as you go through life. So how do I do this? And he starts this second section in verse 8 with a very familiar phrase, vanity of vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity. And this is his conclusion. In other words, what he has been saying throughout the book of Ecclesiastes is that life is meaningless without God. I want you to hear that message clearly today. If you are going through life and you do not know God, it has no purpose. It has no meaning. It has no value. And so the author of this section is saying, you need to understand, life with God now all of a sudden has purpose. It has meaning. And there's nobody that we could learn this lesson from any better. Solomon, as we've studied, is the guy that had everything he could possibly want. Whatever he wanted, he could have. He was very, very wealthy. He was the king. He was the ruler. He was the son of David. He had high position. He had fame. He had wealth. He had the best of everything made available. And he says, after going through all of this, I look back and I see that all of that has no value, that it's empty, that it's meaningless, that it's all vanity. It's this image of a puff of smoke, of the vapor that comes off of your breath in a cold winter's day. that's there and all of a sudden gone. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. And again, Solomon is a guy that would know that. 1 Kings chapter 11 helps us gaze in on his life a little bit. It says in 1 Kings chapter 11, you'll see this up on the screen. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. His anchor was foreign women. That's what he loved, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not fascinate with them, nor shall you fascinate with you, for you will surely turn your heart away to their gods. And Solomon held fast to these in love. And he had several hundred wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not full-heartedly devoted to the Lord, his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. So he was fascinated with these other women, the women that God had told the children of Israel not to connect themselves with. And he went after them, and that was his anchor. That was what he was holding on to. And he had come to a place in his life at some point where he had turned back to God. And now we have Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes. And he's going to tell us in these remaining verses that we really need to establish our knowledge of God. And he's going to say, here's how you do it. Here's how you establish your knowledge of God. He says in verses 11 and 12, follow the right counsel. Notice verse 11. In addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. And he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. We know that he wrote the book of Proverbs, and he arranged words. He was a master of that. The preacher sought to find delightful words and the right words of truth correctly. So he searched for the right words to identify what was before him and the expression. He had such a gift to do that. He says in verse 11, notice, the words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. Words of wise men are like goads. Do you know what a goad is? A goad is that device that's used by a shepherd or by someone who's working with cattle to prod them along. They didn't have shock collars back then. They had goads. We've kind of advanced our society a little bit today. We've got the shock collars, and they had goads then. And so that was the modern day equivalent to a shock collar. So it's prodding them along. And so he's saying that the words of wise men are like that. I have found in our study through the book of Ecclesiastes that there have been times that I didn't quite like what the preacher had to say. I felt he was a little bit intrusive, kind of stepped on some toes a little bit. I don't know if you've felt that. And so it's that prodding. It's what he's saying here. Words of wise men are like that. They're prodding you along. You may not like those words. You may not even agree with those words. But they're there for your protection. They're given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. You may feel like that if you are a student who has just completed his final semester. You feel like I've been reading, and there's just so much information. He's not criticizing information here. He's not saying, just devote yourself to one book. Don't worry about anything else. He's not saying that. He's not criticizing the process of learning. He's not doing that at all. But he is saying, be very careful where you find your wisdom. You see, in our culture today, we tend to run to people who are the same age, experiencing the same problems, going through the same difficulties, and we ask them for wisdom, and what we end up getting is advice. Now let me tell you, there's a great difference between wisdom and advice. There's a big difference. When we ask for wisdom and we get advice, we need to be very careful. We need to be leery. And so he's saying very carefully, make sure that you follow the right counsel. Listen to the right words and heed the voices. And we've been able to do that in our study of Ecclesiastes. We've been able to listen to right counsel. We've been able to set the course straight as we come each week and we devote ourselves to the task of studying God's Word as a congregation, and we go out and we work through the same material in our community groups. We're dedicating ourselves to the task of listening to wise counsel. We want to be under wise counsel. We want to be very careful that we hear that. And so one of the ways that we learn to establish deeper knowledge in God is by learning to listen to wise counsel. But he doesn't just leave us there. Notice verse 13. The second part is going to be fearing God. We need to come to a place where we fear God. The conclusion, verse 13, when all has been heard, is fear God. Now, a lot of times when we come across this phrase, fear God, in the Bible, we often soften it, like putting a trampoline under somebody who is about to fall. We soften it that way, and we say, well, really, when the Bible talks about fearing God, it doesn't really mean to be fearful of God. Well, guess what? It actually does. It really means to be fearful of God. You need to go through life with a perspective that God is present, that he sees everything that you do, that he hears everything that you say. You need to go through life with a God conscience. You need to be in fear of the presence of God. Now, thankfully, because of his grace, we have a loving Father that we can run to, that we can confess our sins before. But let me tell you, when Isaiah stood before God and God called him to the ministry, you know, he wasn't eating cupcakes and sipping on tea. I mean, he said the foundations of the building were trembling. He was in the presence of Almighty God. He was scared to death. And he's saying, here I am, God, send me. He's saying this in a very fearful way because he recognizes the presence of God. How our lives would be different if we had a healthy fear of God. We would act differently. We would speak differently. We would even think differently if we had a healthy perspective of God, a healthy fear of God. Fear God. That's what he's saying here. You want to grow in your knowledge of the Almighty? Go through life with a healthy fear of God. He doesn't just leave us there. Obviously, go through life seeking the right counsel and having a fear of God. The third thing here is keep his commandments. Keep his commandments. You notice in the latter part of verse 13, and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. This morning, I want you to know you cannot use any excuses before God on the final day. You can't stand before him and say, I just did not know. Nobody ever told me. I didn't have knowledge of this. If somebody would have just come and spoke these words to me, things would be so different. Nobody came to me. He's saying this applies to everyone. Nobody is going to escape this. We're going to stand before God. This applies to everyone. So we need to have a healthy fear of God, and we need to keep his commandments. The older you get, the harder that becomes, unless you've worked on that at a young age. Number four, developing this knowledge of God. Remember the judgment. Remember the judgment. It ties in very nicely with verse 13 and keeping his commandments, the fact that it applies to every person. Verse 14, for God will bring every act to judgment. Everything which is hidden, whether it's good or evil. Do you not know that the day you stand before God, everything in your life will be laid bare before him? Everything will be open before God. Everything you do, whether it is in the presence of many, or if it's in the silence of your home, everything will be open bare before God. For God will bring every act to judgment. Everything. We need to go through life remembering the judgment. I think it's very interesting that when you read in the New Testament, one of the things that the authors of the New Testament would do, particularly Paul, is he would often remind the church that you are going to be standing in the judgment of God one day. Remember, the judgment of God is coming. And he says, he uses it in both a positive and a negative. You're going through persecution now. Remember, the judgment of God is coming, and endure the persecution that you're going through. Put your hope in Christ. Make sure that He is your anchor, because you are going to stand before God and He is the only solution to the problem that you have. Those are the words of the New Testament authors. They're reminding us of the simple truth that we will stand before the judgment of God. We need to go through life remembering this, that one day we will stand before His judgment. Now, what do we do with this message? What do we even do with this book? In some ways, chapter 12 is really a summary of the entire book. In fact, there's really not anything new that I've said in chapter 12 that Solomon hasn't said throughout this book. So what do we do with this material? Now, I think there are two important questions we need to ask. The first question is very simple. Is your joy in God? Is your joy in God? Are you going through life connected to the anchor that can survive all problems in the world? Is that what you're connected to? Is your joy in God? Or are you going through life like Solomon, trying to convince yourself that you can find joy in other things? I can find pleasure in education. I can find my joy in alcohol. I can find my joy in fame. I can find my joy in material possessions. I can find my joy in all this stuff. That's what Solomon had tried to do. And he comes to the end of this book, and he basically sets us down as a loving pastor, and he says to us, where is your joy? Where is your joy? What is the source of your joy? And there's a second question that I think is very important for us to consider. How can you develop your knowledge? Maybe you're here this morning and you think, well, I kind of go through life and I'm doing this thing of walking with God, but I'm really not plugged into seeking the right counsel, going to His Word and finding the information that I need, or really I'm not going through life with a healthy fear of God. I just don't have a healthy fear of Him. Or maybe I just don't care to keep His commandments. Or I'm going through life and I could care less about the judgment because in my mind that's going to take place many years down the road. I'm not concerned with that. And so I think it would be wise for us to think of at least one of these that He presents for us. And to say, this week I'm going to really focus my mind here. I'm going to go through this week saying, God, teach me your way. Help me understand your wise counsel. Or maybe you go through the week saying, God, give me a healthy fear of your presence. Help me walk each day with the recognition that you are there, that you've gone before me and that you are behind me, that you're everywhere, that everything I say, everything I do, everything I think is before you. That my day is an offering of praise for the life, the breath that you've breathed into me. I'm going to have a healthy fear. Or maybe you need to really focus on keeping His commandments. God, I want to love your commandments. Jesus said to His disciples, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. How will you know that these are your disciples? You will know that these are my disciples because they keep my commandments. That's how you will know. Remember the judgment. Maybe you need to remember the judgment. The reality that judgment will come one day. Judgment will come. That God can use that reality to develop a recognition of who He is and further His influence upon your life. Let me pray for us.